Hello, my name is Mauricio, and I'm excited to welcome you to the talk, Governing Transformative AI. I'm thrilled to introduce you to Markus Anderljung. Anderljung is Head of Operations and Policy Engagement, focusing on growing the Center for the Governance of AI at the Future of Humanity Institute, which is based at Oxford University. Anderljung focuses on making the center's research relevant to important stakeholders, acting as an enabler for research, and contributing to FHI research. He has a background in history and philosophy of science, with a focus on the philosophy of economics and evidence-based policy. Today, he'll be discussing the field of AI governance, with an emphasis on long-term risks and opportunities. We invite you, as always, to use the SwapGrid platform during the session. On the right side panel, feel free to share your thoughts on the live discussion board and leave an upvote to any questions for our speaker to answer at the end of the presentation. After the session, we invite you to use SwapGrid to set up meetings with fellow conference attendees. Without further ado, welcome, Markus.
Hello, everyone. Good to see you all, or I hope, rather, it's good for you to see me. I'm going to be talking today about the field of the governance of AI, in particular with a focus on more transformative possibilities, and giving you sort of a showcase of some of the work going on at the Center for the Governance of AI at the Future of Humanity Institute, where I work. Firstly, you might start by sort of thinking a little bit about what AI governance is. In short, it sort of refers to how humanity can best sort of navigate the transition to a world with advanced AI systems. It sort of focuses in particular on sort of the ethical, the economic, political, military decisions on AI development and deployment that's going to sort of shape the impacts of this technology on the world. But it's not just about sort of this kind of descriptive set of questions, it's also about the normative. So it's trying to understand how these decisions will be made, how this technology will play out, with an eye towards figuring out what actions we should be taking now to sort of make sure that its impacts are as good as possible. Another thing that sort of, another kind of definition that I quite like is more sort of a negative definition. So this is trying to basically just saying something like, even if we solve the challenges of technical AI safety, of sort of aligning AI systems to the intentions of their users, for example, we have a whole bunch of problems still left to go. And AI governance is trying to understand what those problems are and trying to see what we could be doing about them. I think one thing that's particularly useful when thinking about this field is sort of dividing up risk into a few different clusters. One is sort of accident risks, where something happens despite the sort of best intentions of their user or of the creator and causes some kind of accident that causes harm. Another one is sort of malicious use. So the system does what it's supposed to do, but its actor or its sort of user tries to have it do something bad, something that's harmful to the world. I think one other sort of category of risk that I think is particularly important to pay attention to, especially if you're sort of coming at this problem from a governance perspective, is sort of structural risk. And so these are risks that sort of either might, basically risks that might change the incentives of actors such that bad outcomes happen. One example of this might be sort of another sort of important set of risks that people often think about is sort of how strategic or sort of competitive dynamics might lead actors to, for example, underinvest in things that would make sure that their systems are safe. And that might then cause the sort of increase the risk of potentially bad accidents happening. Another sort of cluster of things might be sort of changing the incentive structure for actors in a more sort of concrete way. And so one sort of interesting example of this, I think, is thinking about the invention of the machine gun, which was sort of the early ones were invented by a man called Gatling, who actually, when he invented it, he was sort of thought this would be a good thing for the world, because he reasoned something like, well, we have a certain amount of sort of bullets going out on the field, and if I sort of figure out a machine that could sort of shoot more bullets per sort of soldier that I have on the field, then surely we could just have fewer soldiers on the field. But then sort of lo and behold, this turned out to be some fairly poor reasoning, because he forgot that this sort of efficiency gain might have just been taken out by having more bullets in the field, which is what happened, and which also led to this sort of quite defensive dominant sort of technological suite that we ended up having in the World War I, and that led to sort of trench warfare, which led to a whole bunch of deaths, which I think interestingly was also partly because the actors didn't quite understand the structure that they were in. They didn't quite understand how defensive dominant this technology suite that they had of sort of barbed wire, of machine gun, etc. was. And so they sort of kept sending troops and kept hoping that they'd be able to break through when that was going to be very, very difficult. I think another thing that's sort of important to think about in this space is to sort of realize or reflect on all the ways in which AI governance is going to be a very, very difficult problem. I think one way to get at that is to think about AI technology as a general purpose technology, i.e. a technology that's going to have impacts across a whole bunch of economic, social, military processes, similar to those of sort of electricity, for example. And if that's the case, then this is going to be a very, very difficult technology to govern or to sort of control, primarily because the sort of harms are going to be very, very diffuse, and also there are going to be benefits. And it's going to be very difficult to separate these benefits from the potential harms. And it's going to be difficult to sort of see which things are harmful, which things are beneficial. And it's also going to be difficult to make sure that actors sort of only do the beneficial thing rather than the harmful thing as well. I think this means, it's sort of unclear to me what this means in terms of whether this is an important problem to work on. On the one hand, it might make it even more important to work on if this is sort of a problem that sort of we end up having to solve to be able to get to safe and beneficial outcomes from AI. Or it might be able to, it might just mean that sort of this, we should be focusing on other problems instead, or we should be focused on sort of complementary goods to AI governance, such as better safety, for example. I'll go through some examples that come from the research group at the Center for the Governance of AI. There are also a bunch of other important and interesting research groups in this space. I'll focus on our research because that's the one that I know best. I'll just sort of hop through sort of a romp of like different kinds of research projects that we've been doing, but there's a whole bunch more out there, a whole bunch more that's being done, and a whole bunch more that has been done in the past that you might find really interesting. I'm mainly highlighting things that are sort of more recent that you might not have heard of, and that I find sort of more interesting at the moment. The way that we sort of try to divide up the space of research mainly comes from this research agenda that Alan Defoe, our director, wrote in 2018, which tries to divide up the space in sort of these four categories. So first is sort of the technical landscape, trying to understand what are the kinds of capabilities that we're going to have when. So trying to do forecasting and also trying to understand what actors are going to have access to what capabilities. Then there's sort of politics. So this is trying to understand how political actors, how politicians, governments, maybe even sort of companies and other actors with a significant amount of power, how they're going to interact with this technology, and what kinds of decisions we should be expecting them to make in this domain. Then there's sort of this other cluster of sort of ideal governance. So this is trying to understand what are sort of the kinds of places that we want to go. So what are the kinds of norms that we want to be put in place? What's the kind of institutional design that we want companies to put in place? So for example, what are sort of, if you were to design an ethics board, for example, what should that look like to be able to sort of make sure that this technology is used for good purposes? And then sort of the fourth cluster is trying to take all these three previous clusters, trying to translate them into what do we do today to try to lead to some of these sort of more long-term beneficial outcomes that we're looking for. Starting with the technical landscape, two papers that I find very interesting. One is sort of this piece or this work on this concept of structured transparency, which has come out of a bunch of different directions. For example, a bunch of work done at FHI over the past few years, a lot of the thinking done by Eric Drexler, for example. And the thing that you're trying to do here is you're trying to understand what are ways in which we might be able to, what are the sort of potential benefits or the potential effects of being able to unbundle information more from each other. And so one way to sort of exemplify what we're talking about here is to think about bomb sniffer dogs that sort of, when they walk around the airport, they have this really, really nice feature where they'll be able to tell a guard whether a bomb is in a particular bag. And so then we only need to search that particular bag that the dog thinks that the bomb is in. And so this means that the privacy infringement for the benefit that we get, i.e. fewer bombs on airplanes, etc., is really quite small. If we had a sort of different technological suite, for example, if we didn't know how to train dogs to be able to sniff sniff for bombs, then we might end up in a very different system where maybe the way that we need to be able to guarantee that there weren't any bombs in the airplane might be to look inside of everyone's bags, for example. And this is the kind of thing that we're thinking about in this space. So it's trying to understand how can we use new technologies, or maybe even just use sort of technologies and sort of processes that we have today, that we can sort of unbundle sort of privacy infringing information being spread from the sort of potential beneficial information to be spread. So you can imagine, for example, you might set up a system where a police officer might only be able to access a certain kind of footage, certain kind of CCTV footage, by maybe putting in the face of someone who has been approved as being a likely suspect of a crime. And in that case, maybe the only thing that they get access to might be then get the videos where that face shows up, or sort of the time around that time. And then the thought is that might be a lot less privacy infringing, and so therefore might come with a bunch of benefits. I think there's a lot of interesting work here, and in particular, work that I'm excited about is sort of thinking about what the potential effects of having more technologies like this might be in the world. For example, you might imagine sort of one question that I'm particularly interested in is sort of how these potential benefits will be taken out. So will we take this sort of efficiency gain out in terms of simply having the sort of roughly the same amount of privacy infringement happening in the world, but we just get more benefit out of it? Or is this are these kinds of technologies that on net will be privacy preserving or not? And what might this kind of technology do to a democracy versus an authoritarian state, for example? Seems like very, very important, exciting questions to me. Another set of questions looks at this concept of cooperative AI, which is something that Alan Defo, our director, has been working on a bunch. I think one way to motivate it is just to think about the distinction between horizontal and vertical coordination. And so vertical coordination here is sort of an AI system doing what its principal or what its user wants it to do. So this is, at least historically, a lot of the work that we've been talking about in the sort of technical AI safety space focuses on this particular question, which seems very important. If we don't solve it, it seems like things are going to be bad. But the thought here is that even if we solve that problem, we're going to have additional problems, which consist of how do we make sure that there is cooperation or coordination between these actors, or between sort of maybe human AI system pairs and other human AI system pairs. And one sort of way to pull out that instinct might be that today you can imagine that sort of my actions are, at least to a pretty large extent, aligned with my will, or sort of what I want to happen, or what I want to do. And even if that's the case, with most of humanity, we end up with a lot of conflict, and we end up with wars. We end up with all kinds of bad stuff. And so if we don't solve this sort of cooperation problems between AI systems as sort of their ability to get things done in the world increases, then we might be leaving a bunch of value on the table, or we might be creating sort of unexpected risks that we weren't thinking about before. And so this is sort of a sort of line of work that's pushing in the direction of trying to build up a field that tries to solve these kinds of problems. So it's trying to understand how AI systems can be cooperating with each other, how AIs and humans can cooperate with each other, but also trying to understand how we can build AI systems that might be able to help human-to-human cooperation. So, for example, are there ways in which we could bootstrap or enhance democracy if we find ways to be able to extract people's preferences in a more efficient way, in a more sort of high fidelity way than sort of someone voting once every 4 years, for example. I think there's a lot of future interesting work going on here. One in particular bit of work that I'm excited about is trying to understand questions that are important to what the impact of doing this work might be. In particular, if you're trying to sort of shape the world in a particular direction. And so one question that seems particularly important is this question of whether we should expect these capabilities of a sort of AI system being able to cooperate to be developed sort of by default, or whether there's something that we sort of should put extra energy into making happen in the world. In the policy and security space, one sort of set of work that I'm particularly excited about looks like sort of similar to this report that we recently published called AI Policy Levers, which looks at what the US government, what their tools might be to try to shape AI research, development, and deployment. And this is basically just a mapping of what all are the different tools, what are the sort of, which ones are they most likely to use given what they currently look like. And I think that seems like a very important set of questions, primarily because the U.S. government might be one of the most sort of important actors in this whole AI governance problem. Sort of future work that I'm very excited about sort of related to this is, one is just looking at other actors and looking at what kinds of tools they might be using in the future. And so looking at the EU, looking at China seems important, and sort of writing these pieces that people can use as sort of reference work to sort of get a brief overview of what's going on. I think another bit of work that seems very important to me is trying to understand how the tools that these actors have access to might change if we end up in a world where AI systems end up being very transformative. And so you could imagine that if AI systems end up being very transformative, we'd end up in a situation where the sort of looking at sort of past precedent of how, for example, antitrust legislation has been used might not be all that informative because the legal or sort of the policymakers might just simply change the laws to sort of suit the current situation, or they might just sort of creatively reinterpret laws that we currently have in place. So trying to understand that, I think, will be very important. In particular, I'm interested in that in the area of antitrust and competition law space. Another piece of work that we've been focusing a lot on and that I would recommend you have a look at is looking at what we can learn from other historical analogies that we might be able to draw to AI technology, for example. And so one example here is a piece of work looking at the period right after the Second World War, where arguably we have this quite unique opportunity where the world was sort of uniquely situated to be able to put international controls on a very, very powerful technology, i.e. nuclear weapons. So we had recently had a world war. The world was suffering war fatigue. We recently dropped these two bombs that sort of had a big impact around the world and sort of shaped people's imagination in all kinds of ways. And on top of that, we also had the US, which for about 6 to 7 years had this monopoly on nuclear weapons. And so you'd imagine that this would be a uniquely useful, uniquely important, uniquely good window to put in place international controls of nuclear weapons. It turned out that this didn't really work out, and to learn more about why that is and what kind of lessons one might be able to draw from that case study, I would really recommend you have a look at this report. Looking at sort of the ideal governance space, the sort of main way that I think of this work is basically looking at what are the beliefs of different kinds of actors in this space. So, for example, looking at what are machine learning researchers, what are their beliefs about what direction they want AI technology to go, what are the public's beliefs about where this technology might be able to go, or where it ought to go. And then that seems like important inputs into this question of what are the kinds of systems, the kinds of institutional design, the kinds of policies we should be putting in place over time. And so this is sort of a sort of set of work that we put a bunch of energy into, for example, by Bao Zhang and Noemi Drexler, thinking about what kinds of surveys we need to be running here. We're also more and more trying to look at the space of AI policy. And so one sort of example of a report here that I'm particularly excited about is looking at the extent to which the EU, its forthcoming sort of AI legislation, which compared to the world looks like it's going to be quite stringent, and what global effects that might have. There's this thing called the Brussels effect, where in some situations we actually see something that's kind of the opposite of sort of a regulatory race to the bottom, i.e. that the EU putting in place more stringent legislations end up having a global effect, primarily because a company that needs to comply with EU rules ends up being cheaper for that company to then just comply with those rules across the world. And so the sort of core question that we're interested in here is just trying to understand, should we expect something similar to happen in the AI space? And if that's the case, that would be very interesting for a number of reasons. For example, it might just mean that the EU as an actor becomes a lot more important than we might have otherwise thought. Another piece of work that we worked on a whole bunch is this question of whether and how, if so, companies should put in place something called a windfall clause, which is basically trying to have companies promise that if they sort of win the AI jackpot, if they end up seizing and producing a whole bunch of wealth via their AI systems, what should we then, in that case, they promise that they'll give back some of this benefit, some of this wealth to the rest of the world. And the thought here is that this might be able to sort of reduce incentives from companies, but also from governments, etc., to sort of race or try to really push to be among the sort of the first or the most dominant actors in this space. And I think in general, this is sort of one mechanism in this space of sort of how we might be able to redistribute wealth if it's the case that AI ends up producing a whole bunch of it. That seems important to explore. I think there's a whole bunch of other ones we ought to be exploring as well, like, for example, how sort of taxation might be used in this space as well. Yeah, so those are some examples of the kind of work that we're doing and that one might be able to do in this space. Hopefully that's given you some ideas. If you want more, I'd recommend you have a look at our website, governance.ai. You could also have a look at some of these pieces here, and you could also just shoot me an email if you're interested as well. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Markus, for laying out this landscape of AI governance. We've got lots of interesting questions from the chat, so let's dive in. One thing people are wondering about is generally for undergraduates or early career professionals interested in making a positive impact on AI governance. What advice do you have?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and thank you all for listening to me yammer on about these things. Yeah, so I think there's, in general, like giving careers advice to a huge number of people at once, I find very tricky. I think that sort of the most useful things I can say is stuff like, if you want to have an important impact especially in this space, but I think in a lot of spaces in sort of this general area of trying to do something about existential risk and whatnot, is try to make sure that you keep engaged with the research coming out, and that you, like, as much as possible, try to do the work required to start forming inside views on as many of the sort of crucial questions that you care about. That's not to say that your inside views are the ones that are going to matter the most. It's more that, like, the work that, like, the benefit that you get out of trying to build an inside view is, like, it's very, very helpful. In particular, because it means that you'll sort of discover things that might be wrong, discover ways that you might be able to contribute, etc. So I think in general, the kinds of advice I would give would be to try to learn as much as possible about the space, keep engaging with the research, go to conferences like these, talk to people, and then sort of once you've done that and you're still sort of excited about the field, then do what you can to sort of try to get your foot in the door somewhere and sort of try out the work. You could do your dissertation about something relevant, those kind of things.
Great, thanks. And then Christina from the audience asks, is there a global initiative or what kind of work is happening toward creating institutions for international AI governance?
Yeah, so there's a decent amount. So first, there's like a number of groups or sort of like IGOs setting up AI specific bodies. And so, yeah, for example, we have something called GPI that was set up fairly recently. The OECD has set up something called the OECD Observatory. Those things are happening. In my mind, some of the most important sort of AI governance, like in my mind, the most important AI governance that will happen in the world won't happen at these kinds of institutions. It will happen at the institutions that just are doing the global governance. So it will happen at institutions like G8 and the General Assembly at the UN and these kinds of things. And so I think that's the kind of stuff that you should be thinking about when you think about how AI will be governed at the global scale.
Great. And then another question, you discussed how a lot of the current work in AI governance tries to forecast the long-term future dynamics of technological and the political dynamics of AI. It seems like a really hard problem, potentially hard enough that people will have to make big governance decisions well before we figured out these things. So is there some point, and if so, at what point should the field shift from big picture forecasting to more concrete policy work?
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, to some extent, I think that's already happening. Like, I think there are like important decisions are being made in the world that presumably will have long-term consequences on this field. So the EU is rolling out a bunch of legislation on how AI will be used, and that's likely to have sort of trajectory changing effects. And those effects are likely going to be important. And if one could sort of have an impact on those, that seems important. So I think in sort of overall, my answer is just that like there is productive work to do in sort of the sort of more concrete sort of what should policymakers do today. There's productive work to do there today. And I guess in general, just sort of as this space, there's a bunch of different variables that will change what kind of work is most valuable when. And one of those variables is just a thing of like, how much strategic insight do we have? And that will hopefully just sort of go up over time. And that will mean that sort of as that goes up, then the like value of the policy work goes up. But it might also be the case that sort of you have particularly important opportunities to have an impact now. It might also be the case that you want to sort of, it might be one thing I'm unsure about is like the extent to which it's like cheaper to buy influence now, or like if you want to buy sort of, if you want to become a person who will like end up being important in future decisions being made in this space, then maybe you want to invest in that now. And maybe that's a better investment to do now than to do in the future. And that seems kind of plausible to me. And so, yeah, in short, I think there's a bunch of that kind of work that should be done now, keeping in mind that like, yeah, maybe the strategic picture isn't just quite as clear as you'd like.
Great, thanks. Let's do one more quick question. On this note, are there actions policymakers can take now that seem robustly good for the future of AI?
Yeah, so I think there are. I think overall my view is that I would like there to be more, or I would like to have like more thorough answers to these questions. And so one thing that I like am very excited about they're happening more, and I think is starting to happen more, is like people doing what I kind of call like policy development research in the sort of long-termist AI governance space. And yeah, I think there's a bunch of potential actions, or there's a bunch of exciting, like pretty powerful levers that are sort of starting to be pulled by the world. So for example, in the US, it's likely that we're going to have some new stuff going on with antitrust, and that will sort of affect tech companies in a large way. Presumably that will affect the future of AI. It seems like a great thing to have good answers to which way is good to go, or like what kinds of antitrust like legislation we want in place for the future of AI governance, for example. And so I think that there is, yeah, a bunch of that kind of work that would be helpful. Some examples of actions that I think can be taken today, like I think a really big cluster is like goes under this umbrella, what you might call like differential technological development. So you try to differentially sort of boost a certain direction of the technology. So for example, you could imagine that like, oh, we want the NSF and whatnot to invest more in AI safety things, or we might want them to invest in ways in which you can verify what a system or what a user is doing with a certain system, where that kind of research will likely be in a lot of different worlds, will be very, very helpful to various kinds of governance solutions that you're going to want to put in place. I also think that there's sort of one, if you're interested in sort of, in my mind, sort of the best example of work that goes sort of the full way from like tricky, high-level strategic considerations to some like concrete actions that policymakers can take today. That's like been done quite thoroughly. It comes out of CSET, which is this whole bit of work on whether or not and to what extent the US should try to keep semiconductor manufacturing equipment and other processes that might be needed to create high-end chips from like China having access to this. And yeah, I think I would love to have more work that is done as thoroughly on other questions as well. That's not to say that even though that's the case, I'm still not confident what the right call is for policymakers. But it seems likely that at least engaging with that work will hopefully improve your world picture and hopefully have you make some better decisions.
Yeah, makes sense to me. Thank you. I think that's all we have time for today. So thank you so much for a wonderful session and for sharing your time. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, guys.